So we ended our last conversation with the 18th century context for the rise of the Great Awakening, and then the shape that the Great Awakening took amongst its two primary leaders and evangelists, George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. Now we're going to talk about the results, the impact, and the important cultural shifts that took place in the church and in American life more broadly among the colonies as a result of the Great Awakening. First of all, in terms of the results of the awakening itself, there was a rapid increase of the number of people professing faith in Jesus Christ, if episodic. Didn't really last very long. But in Connecticut, from 1730 to 1740, went from 8 new members at a church to 33, right? A factor of 4. The 1740s actually saw a slow decline in membership, so it wasn't a long-lasting change in professions and church membership, but certainly an explosion of the number of new members being taken in by each individual local church. In New England, it actually led to a struggle between what we call the old lights and the new lights among the inheritors of the Puritan tradition. The difference between the two was their view was a new view on conversion that focused on God shining a light on the human soul. So while these new lights cared about the ties between the church and the state and the importance of church order, they certainly paid close attention to it. Their focus was on a pure church through conversion and new methods of evangelization. They were exploring new ways to communicate the truth of the gospel and less reliant upon old structures and ways of doing things. The old lights, on the other hand, typified most strongly by people like Charles Chauncey, who's on your screen there, held to the old hierarchies and rejected any of these new measures. Eventually, these old Calvinists would eventually become Unitarians, as they were liberal in their notions of faith, but much more conservative in their disdain for the intemperate enthusiasm for the common people. They didn't want to see the truth of the gospel message being entrusted to snake oil salesmen out on the frontier, but emphasized the structures and the decorum and the order that the traditional relationship between the church and the state provided in old New England communities like Boston and other places like that. So in summary, right, there was increasing religious diversity unleashed by the Great Awakening. There were new changes in faith and practice and a new approach. And this is very clearly revealed when you look at, for example, the rise of the Baptists and the influence that they have in American life. Now, this was a mistake. There we go. I don't know why that screen was in there. That was misplaced. The leader we want to talk about today, from 1724 to 1806, is the life of Isaac Backus. He remained Calvinistic in his theology, but he changed his fundamental belief that baptism was to be reserved for adults, not for babies. Baptism, like the Baptists all throughout Europe, on the heels of the the Reformation, argued that baptism was on profession of faith only, versus the traditional New England support for connection between church and state, which emphasized infant baptism. Backus was involved in the founding of a Baptist college in Rhode Island in 1764 that eventually became Brown University. There was also, in terms of learning and ministerial preparation and the order and structure that we've talked about, sort of an unleashing of new learning institutions and colleges. Princeton was founded by the Presbyterians in 1746. Queen's College, which eventually became Rutgers, was founded by the Dutch Reformed in 1764. And then Dartmouth, which is a Congregationalist college, was founded in 1769, and its early focus was actually on the education for Native American converts in that region of New England. I want to talk for just a minute about a term that you came across in your reading that I thought may take a moment of explanation, and that is the difference between a regular and a separate Baptist. Essentially, it is stages of radicalization. So let me explain that. The regular Baptists adhered more strictly to traditional Baptist belief and practices. They tended to be more conservative in their views, emphasizing a more structured, church-related and centered approach to theology and worship. The term regular then referred to their conformity to established Baptist doctrine and practice. But the separate Baptists arose in the context of the Great Awakening. That was a religious revival that sparked fervent emotional and experiential expressions of faith. In this experiential and experimental context, they were more influenced by the revivalist movement, often emphasizing personal, individual experience of conversion and a more enthusiastic, expressive approach to worship. The separates were seen as somewhat more radical when compared to the regulars, particularly in their rejection of more formal church hierarchy and their emphasis on a more spontaneous, heartfelt faith. In addition to that, they very clearly and strongly rejected any connection at all between church and state in this new American context, as they were part of the increasing diversity of the American Christian expression. Along the way, I want to talk for just a minute here about this transition from Puritan to evangelical. And here I'm basically summarizing the language that was provided by Mark Noll, historian, in one of his histories of American evangelicalism. But during this time, in the crucible of the first half of the 18th century, we basically have the transition from Puritan to evangelical. Remember, history takes a long time. It's not like they were all of a sudden Americans, right? History is not like a sort of a happens just rapidly like that, but kind of a low, slow swinging gait, right? That is inexorable, but it takes time. So what does it mean to go from Puritan to evangelical as a new expression of Christian belief, practice, and experience? I have it summarized in these handful of principles that we might be able to make sense out of. The first is that individual faith became, to be redundant, faith became more individualistic. It was about you and your individual conversion. The appeal was not to the whole community, but to you, right? To you as an individual. Do you understand that you are living a life of sin and removed from the grace of God? And are you going to respond to the grace that God offers you? The second was that it also showed new sources of authority. When Whitefield came to town, sometimes he preached in churches, sometimes he preached in the town square, sometimes he preached on the outside of town. That was actually more for the Second Great Awakening, but a lot of his preaching was out of doors. And in addition to that, the practice of Whitefield was actually to reverse the reigning assumptions of the era. Historian Harry Stout put it this way: instead of invoking authority as a means of popular control and influence, Whitefield would make himself popular, and then on the basis of that popularity, claim authority and status. Popularity and attractiveness became first, not settled structures of authority. Salvation itself, third, was mediated by nothing but the written and spoken word of God. Your local church, church authority, powerful leaders in the church were less important than you directly meeting God. They also began to remake churches in their new image with new structures and more vibrant, flexible worship practices. And also they sought leaders with charismatic power. One academic historian puts it this way, that evangelicals have always been empire builders. Big names, powerful personalities, strong public presence that can unleash powerful following among those who listen to their sermons. As the early stages of democratization begin to take effect in the late 18th century, this really marks the hallmark of American religion. Powerful leaders in a democratic context, expressing their desire for conversion and having people follow them. They also had lay people taking initiative to meet together in prayer outside of the church and outside of the admonition of the local pastor to be able to control it. And also important to remember here is the movement toward reform. I cannot emphasize this enough. Today's evangelicals are not reform-minded. They tend to be, actually, progressive evangelicals, they are. But when you think of evangelicals today, you don't think social radicals. You don't think social change. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, we will eventually see that evangelicals were among the early advocates for women's roles in society. They were advocates for abolitionism and the absolute fundamental change in understanding of the role of the church in the world that was to be involved in social reform along with revivalism. And so as we talk about that movement towards social reform, I want to talk a little bit about this, the way that they got involved by engaging those outside of the positions of structure, power, and authority in the early 18th century, what one historian has called their effort to preach to the underclass. Gilbert Tennant was a New York Presbyterian who in the course of his itinerant ministry saw multitudes awakened, and even multitudes awakened even among the African American and the slave communities that he served. Samuel Davies was a Presbyterian from Hanover, Virginia. He preached specifically to slaves, eager to convert blacks to share in regular church observances, including the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Under the impulse of revivalism, then, the chasm between white and black churches was breached. The revival message of personal experience and personal transformation with God resonated for all people, regardless of race and class. I would also use this opportunity to say that out of the evangelical experience actually came some reform, radical abolitionism by the time we get to the early 19th century. We also see the formation of what we see as a uniquely black or African American religious experience in the early to mid and late 18th century. The very first continuing black church in North America was Silver Bluff Church in Aiken County, South Carolina. David George was an African American preacher. He established his ministry in 1773, and then from the religion of the slaveholders, he established a religion for the slaves themselves. Samuel Hopkins, who was a New Light minister in New England, studied with Jonathan Edwards. In 1776, he published a pamphlet sent to the Continental Congress arguing that how could the Continental Congress complain of enslavement to Parliament when they overlooked slavery in the colonies and the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of black slaves in the colonies. He said, quote, "Behold the sons of liberty, oppressing and tyrannizing over many thousands of poor blacks who have as good a claim to liberty as themselves." Finally, we see Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley, who was born a slave but emancipated by the Boston family that had originally purchased her, became North America's first black poet. And her first published poem was actually a memorial to George Whitefield, seizing the power of his revivalist message for black liberation. All that is to say is it's not as if early to mid 18th century evangelicalism or revivalism actually achieved or was even fundamentally committed to abolitionism or against the institution of slavery. But rather, Mark Noll put it this way: revivalism did not end slavery. Sorry about all these alerts that keep coming up on my screen. Revivalism did not end slavery, but it served to direct new attention to the spiritual lives of African Americans. In another couple generations, this bringing attention to the nature of the slave identity and experience would eventually lead to early efforts at abolitionism in American life. So what effect then did the Great Awakening have on slavery? I'm sorry. Did the Great Awakening have on the colonies and our emergence towards the American Revolution? The first thing to say is that the Great Awakening was truly the nation's first national event. Now that's a bit of a anachronistic term, right? Because we're not a nation yet. We're just individual colonies. But there was a series of experiences that drew the colonies together with new patterns of religious thinking and extemporaneous preaching and engaging the church and the world in a new way that was experienced across all of the colonies. It also created a bit of a melting pot early on. Immigrant communities that had been much more insular eventually became acquainted with one another and began to have a more shared, what I would call, proto-American experience. Also, the process of Europeans becoming Americans had begun, I think, in its early stages. We need to be careful before we're too triumphalist here, because as late as the 1750s, the Albany Plan of Union was actually turned down by the majority of the colonial assemblies. They could not figure out a way to make it work. They saw themselves more as individual English colonies than as joint American states or colonies at that point. But certainly the process of becoming American had begun. There was also an increased suspicion of Europe as they expressed new models of leadership and traveling evangelists and saw religious power as increasingly going to the hands of the people rather than only their leaders. So because of that sort of emerging effect of the Great Awakening on American life, the churches actually, in many ways, I would argue, paved the way for what would eventually happen in the 1770s with the American Revolution. And in order to understand that, we want to talk here for just a few minutes about the relationship between republicanism, or the tradition and the emerging understanding of republicanism in the 18th century with the expression of Christian faith at that particular time. And so I thought I would provide this summary of 18th century republicanism that might help summarize the changes in the mindset that were taking place in the transatlantic world in the 18th century. A new, I don't want to use the word ideology, but a new tradition of republicanism that had a new understanding, seizing on the ancient ideas of ancient Greece and Rome, bringing them through the Enlightenment thinkers and into the early modern and the modern period, eventually came up with a whole set of ideas that can be summarized, I think, in these 7 basic ideas. Number 1 is popular sovereignty. That government derives its authority from the people and not from a divine monarch. Do not underestimate the absolute significance and importance of that pattern of thinking. Authority is not only hierarchical, but bottom-up. It comes from the people. The second is that a republican form of government, Europe and America, requires a virtuous citizenry. If you're not going to have a divine right of kings, you have to have citizens who are virtuous, that understand the commitments and the importance of citizenship. There was also a growing opposition to monarchy and aristocracy. This emerging opposition to monarchy and aristocracy can perhaps be no better illustrated than the 1776 pamphlet of Thomas Paine called Common Sense. The suspicion of unchecked power, right? That absolute power corrupts absolutely, the writings of Hobbes, of natural rights, that rights are imbued upon individual people by nature's God and the very right of nature, not by those above you who give you that right. There was a poor view of human nature, right? That humans both had the capacity for sin and evil as well as good. This overlapped with the Christian message of sinfulness and the ongoing struggle between Christ, who promoted liberty, and Satan, who represented tyranny. 4 is the separation of powers and mixed government. In order to keep corruption from overtaking the government, you had to separate the powers that was eventually enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, but you also had to have mixed government, some aristocracy and some popular democracy, right? Which is why in the American Republic you have a Senate that's made up of 2 people from each state. That's generally seen to be more the vestige of the aristocracy, and then popularly elected officials that make up Congress. And so this idea of representation, separation of powers, and mixed government is part of the Republican tradition. In addition to that, government has checks and balances. You separate the powers, and then they check one another's authority. They were very suspicious of absolute power and tyranny. 6th, they believed in the rule of law, that laws were rooted in nature and they applied to everyone equally. And finally, in the importance of civic engagement and citizenship. Well, it just so turns out, right, that this emerging understanding and this idea of republicanism actually overlapped really, really well with an American understanding of government, right? I'm sorry, forgive me. This understanding, this political theory of republicanism meshed well with the Christian understanding of the human's relationship to God. So, for example, we might say that both had a skeptical view of human nature. Both the Puritans and the Republicans defined virtue, freedom, and social well-being in similar terms. Puritans emphasized the absence of sin, and Republicans emphasized the absence of corruption or arbitrary power. For the Puritan, the good society was one where sin was vanquished and people stood on guard against sin. For the Republicans, they defined the good society as one in which freedom from tyranny was preserved and citizens resisted the corruption of unchecked power. There was also a tradition of millennialism, right? The coming of the kingdom of God. The church had a struggle in the early Puritan mindset to show the world how society was actually to be organized to hasten the coming of God's kingdom in the world. And also, the Republicans actually had a view that God's eventual victory began to mirror the language of the struggle against Britain, that we would overcome tyranny and abject and unquestioned power with the language of democracy and republicanism. So Christian and Republican points of view merged during the Revolution to create the birth of a distinctly American Christian nationalism. Let me say that again. Christian and Republican points of view merged during the Revolution to birth a uniquely and clear understanding of American Christian nationalism. Mark Noll put it this way: evangelical Christianity melded with Republican political theory into the morally charged ideology that fueled the war for independence. With that new understanding came a Christianized understanding and commitment to freedom from tyranny. And the importance of liberty was a Christian term, a Republican term, an American term. John Witherspoon was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He immigrated from Scotland 8 years before becoming president of Princeton. He was clearly an evangelical in that particular mindset. He called on fellow Scottish immigrants to realize that the time to choose had come. In his sermon called The Dominion of Providence Over the Passions of Men, he argued that colonists should resist unjust tyranny and that God would bring good from evil. In the language of Charles Carroll, right? Actually, let me quote Witherspoon a little more extensively here. Here's a quote from that sermon. "The ambition of mistaken princes, the cunning and cruelty of oppressive and corrupt parliamentary ministers, and even the inhumanity of brutal soldiers, however dreadful, shall finally promote the glory of God, and in the meantime, while the storm continues, his mercy and kindness shall appear in prescribing bounds to their rage and fury. Less than 2 months, by the way, after preaching that sermon, Witherspoon would become the only clergyman to sign the Declaration of Independence. Charles Carroll was Catholic. He was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. But he steadfastly stuck to his convictions for liberty, and he eventually signed the Declaration, and during the war served his state and new national government in several important posts. In Carroll's mind, current laws against Catholics that were found throughout the colonies were not most important. What he was investing in was the hope of a better day to come. He said this, quote, "When I signed the Declaration of Independence, I had in view not only our independence from England, but the toleration of all sects professing the Christian religion and communicating to them all great rights." Unquote. So clearly what we see is out of this revivalistic spirit that was unleashed by the Great Awakening and the emergence of what a definable tradition of American evangelicalism, the meshing and the melding of that with the Republican ideology created a revolutionary mindset that is the origins of a distinctly American Christian nationalism that would take its own ongoing shape in the 19th, 20th, and into the 21st century. I think what's also important to recognize, kind of a side here, because it's not the focus of our conversation, but certainly this could be worth a lot of study on its own, is that in addition to all of these revolutionaries, there were also other groups of people who had a completely different understanding of the revolution. First of all were the Loyalists. Somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of all colonists were Loyalists, and they were loyal for a bunch of different reasons. Some believed that there was a religious duty to the mother country. The Church of England, of course, had the highest percentage of Loyalists, but that Loyalist perspective actually cut through all traditions. Key among this understanding was a different hierarchical reading of the Bible. Jonathan Boucher, who was an Anglican minister in Maryland, argued this way. He said that the New Testament teaches that obedience to government is every man's duty and is commanded by God. Miles Cooper, who was president of what would become Columbia, said, quote, "When once the people conceive the governed to be superior to the governors, and that they may set up their pretended natural rights in opposition to the positive law of the state, they will naturally proceed to despise dominion and speak evil of dignities and to open the door for anarchy, confusion, and every evil work to enter." Unquote. The fear was once you lose traditional authority and hierarchy, you open the door to anarchy. In addition to Loyalists, there were other religious groups, Christian groups in the country, that were pacifist, right? These were Quakers, Mennonites, Moravians, Schwenkfelders, the Church of the Brethren, and even some early Methodists. Christopher Sauer was a leading German-language printer in colonial America and spread this pacifist message throughout the colonies. It was most clearly expressed by Anthony Benicet and his complete rejection of the state when it came to Christian identity. In a tract published in 1778, he stated his position with great specificity. And he said this, quote, "Christ positively enjoins us to love our enemies, to bless them that curse us, to do good to those that hate us, and to pray for them which despitefully use and persecute us. On the other hand, war requires of its votaries that they kill, destroy, lay waste, and to the utmost of their power distress and annoy, and in every way and manner deprive those they esteem their enemies of support and comfort." Unquote. In this mindset, how could any Christian be an advocate of war, even if it is for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Theologian Stanley Hauerwas put it this way, that being asked to give your life to the nation is like being asked to give your life to the phone company. It's an artificial identity. It's not real. The call of Christ is to sacrifice yourself and never to engage in killing, destruction, or warfare, but always to bless those that persecute you. We need to have that conversation in class. What is the demand of the Christian? We see two distinct ways of thinking here: an emerging Christian nationalism and an emphasis on loyalism, but more importantly, a strong argument for pacifism. That's going to end this lecture. The next one is going to be a conversation about the faith of the founders and an ongoing conversation about the origins of Christian nationalism. And we'll talk about this idea of Christian America. Thanks.